I told myself I was going to do something a bit more simple this time, and a headboard seemed like a pretty straightforward project to tackle. So I then threw all of that right out the window and decided to make the most complex headboard that I could possibly come up with. When making a piece of furniture, I'd say for the most part, builds generally go in chronological order or sequential order. I build them in sections, then put all of those sections together to make a finished piece. There's usually some overlap of things, some multitasking, but like if I'm making a table, I'll pretty much make the top start to finish, then I'll make the legs and base assembly start to finish, then put them all together to make the final table. But this piece didn't go like that at all. I was jumping all over the place and between all different parts of the build from start to finish, and I debated whether or not to order the video as it happened to kind of really show the process. But I'll be honest, even I was getting confused watching back all the footage, so I decided to reorganize the video to make it as easy to follow as possible. All that being said, making this walnut panel was actually the first thing I did, and it kind of makes sense because it's the center panel for what I'm making, which is this fancy headboard. And big surprise, I can't do anything simple, it seems, so once again I kind of threw the book at this one, and I've got all sorts of stuff going on like floating nightstands, integrated lighting, wireless charging, stuff like that. And the overall look of it is kind of this slatted thing with a contrasting center panel, and this center panel is getting some inlaid brass. So like I said, I kind of threw everything at this one. And one of the things that making YouTube videos about making furniture has done, at least to me, is given me this feeling that every build needs to be bigger or more intricate or more different, more interesting than the last. And that causes me to come up with stuff like this. But I always wonder, as I'm building and as I'm editing these videos, would everyone prefer to watch me do stuff like this, where I'm really kind of pushing myself, trying new things, figuring stuff out as I go? Or is it more enjoyable to watch me build stuff that's more in my wheelhouse, stuff I know I can pull off, and that way I can get a bit more into techniques and woodworking rather than fumbling around with things like LED lights? But I'm honestly interested to hear what people prefer, so let me know. So I decided to organize this video in a way that at first wasn't really intentional, but it kind of ended up being all of the solid wood stuff together, then all of the plywood stuff. And all of the solid wood, which I got from Woodworker's Source, came to me pre-milled, but I still needed to get it down to my desired dimensions. All of the maple, which is this light colored wood, is going to be the slats on the headboard. And you might think, oh, that's pretty easy, just plane down the boards to the thickness you want, then rip them to the finished width. But let's build a little bit of tension here and foreshadow things by saying not everything is as easy as it seems. Okay, now you might be saying, I'm not really that worried about what's going to happen. There isn't much tension here. But if you look closely, that's where all the tension is, in this board, not necessarily in my storytelling. Wood tends to hold tension, and that especially becomes apparent when you cut a wide board into smaller strips along its length. You basically release all that tension when cutting, and those thin boards often come out crooked. So what I actually did here was initially mill everything, then cut my boards into slightly wide strips. Then I could reestablish a flat edge, and after that, I could cut all of them to final width, which should give me a good shot at everything staying pretty straight and flat. It's funny how your perspective on certain things kind of shifts depending on the project. This walnut that I'm starting to mill here is going to be used for the 2 nightstands. In other projects, like if I were going to build a side table with a drawer or something like that, a cabinet like these would be a big part of the build. And it would be something that, I don't know, I think about a lot. They're mitered boxes with grain wrapped panels, so they require some work and some concentration. But in the case of this headboard, they were honestly a fairly small part of the piece, and really one of the few things in this build that I've done plenty of times before, and it made them feel like the easy part. I remember the morning when I was planning to make them thinking, okay, I just need to knock out these 2 walnut boxes this morning, then I can get back to the important stuff, which honestly, looking back on it now, feels a little bit weird. But because I've done this so many times before, I was able to get all of my panels made, and I cut in the miters on my table saw, even without the help of my little digital angle gauge. But as usual, just when you're feeling good, the universe always has a way to humble you. I had all the panels pretty much ready to go. I'd even remembered to cut in the edge details before the glue up, which was just a simple chamfer on the front edge. And I had cut in the dominoes on the bevels to help with the glue up, and I'd gotten as far as even gluing in some dominoes into one of the side panels. And I was just about to glue up the first box when I remembered that I needed the whole wireless charging thing. Of course, we need wireless charging. And of course, I need to take care of that before the boxes are actual boxes. The chargers I'm using are able to charge through fairly thick material, but the panels for the nightstands were just slightly too thick. So I had to quickly model up a simple cutout that would go into the top panel of each box, so the charger would be within the panel thickness limits to actually work. It was a pretty easy thing to do, but it would have been, I guess, impossible to do after I had glued up the boxes. A project like this is a little deceiving. I'm making one headboard, but the design is essentially one piece of furniture that's mirrored. So I'm basically making 2 of everything, which, I'll be honest, has its pros and cons. On one hand, I'm making 2 of everything, so I get to kind of figure it out on the first one, then the second one is a breeze. So from a time perspective, it maybe adds 50% more time to get 100% more outcome. That math might be a little optimistic, but it sounds nice. It's also great for the video side of things. Again, I can figure it out on the first one, essentially not worry about filming and all of that, and just focus on what I'm doing. I mean, you can see here how much marking out I'm doing, a task that takes just about all of my limited brain power, so it takes some of the pressure off, which is nice. Then, on the other hand, you have to build 2 of everything. And building 2 of everything is, it's just a pain. But for the plywood parts of this build, there were some intricacies that were intricate. They were tricky. So having to make 2 of them was actually really nice, especially because I'm having to film. And being able to really focus on figuring everything out on the first one without the camera, it felt like a luxury. And really, most of the intricacy came from the fact that I wanted to do this somewhat hidden, integrated light. The idea is that one of the slats would be able to slide out and rotate with an LED light embedded in the bottom edge. I thought it was a pretty cool idea, and I felt like I had a decent idea of how I could pull it off. And I found all the hardware I needed, these mini drawer slides and these kind of friction hinges. So I was able to come up with a design where the LED slat could slide out from the main panel, rotate up and down, and then slide back in. Remember at the beginning when I was talking about constantly feeling like I need to one-up myself? Well, stuff like this little hidden light are direct products of that feeling, which is great. Maybe that'll be my New Year's resolution, keep one-upping myself. But I suppose at the same time, for the sake of my sanity, I might need to figure out a better way forward, which actually brings me to this video's sponsor, BetterHelp. If you haven't heard of them, BetterHelp is an online therapy platform that makes starting therapy easier and less intimidating for people. Like I just mentioned, it's a new year, and that usually comes with the hope of bigger and better things for ourselves. I know I have goals for myself and my business, but I also know that balancing those goals with other important things in life can be difficult and stressful. Luckily, therapy is a great way to help with stress management, as well as a great way to help us balance all of our goals for the coming year and keep us on track to successfully manage all of life's ups and downs. Therapy lets us talk to a professional who specializes in helping people solve their problems. And while seeking advice from friends and family can be beneficial, getting unbiased advice from a therapist can really be a game changer. I'll have a link in the description, but to get started with BetterHelp, you fill out a questionnaire, and in most cases, you're matched with one of over 30,000 therapists in their network within 48 hours. Once you find a therapist, you can communicate in multiple ways: phone calls, video chat, or even messaging, whichever is the most comfortable for you. And if for some reason you feel like a therapist isn't a great fit, you can switch at any time at no additional cost. So if you're looking for a bit of help to achieve your goals this new year, you can join the over 4 million people that have used BetterHelp to start living a healthier and happier life. Click the link in the description to support this channel and to get 10% off your first month of BetterHelp, so you can connect with a therapist and see if it helps you. All right, thanks BetterHelp. One of the things I struggle with most when making a new piece of furniture is that I can get pretty impatient. I tend to want to get to the bigger parts of the build quickly, and that means I can sometimes get ahead of myself and miss things, kind of like how I almost forgot to create the recess for the wireless chargers a few minutes ago. Over time, though, I feel like I've gotten better at being patient, and this part of the build really tested that. It was time to finally marry the solid wood and plywood parts of this build together and attach the slats. And though it seems pretty straightforward, I managed to overcomplicate the process and really test my foresight and planning abilities, which is why if you were to ever come to my shop, you'd very likely find me like this. So once I'd thought the entire process through at least a handful of times, what I ended up doing was first attaching all of the slats with screws from behind the plywood, and all the slats are still long at this point. And what this did was allow me to have everything in place, so then I could cut all of the slats to length at the same time, which would ensure a nice straight edge between all of them. But then I could remove all of the slats after making that cut because I needed to do some pre-finishing. I wanted the plywood to be black between all of the slats for a little extra contrast, but I obviously couldn't do that with them attached. And then because everything had already been screwed into place before, once I added the black finish, it was pretty easy to get everything back into place, this time with some glue, and permanently attach the slats, which also, unfortunately, had to cover up my beautiful paint job. All right, I have to say, I felt pretty good at this point. And by good, I guess I mean smart, because things were going according to my well thought out plan. But like I've said before, just when you think you've got it figured out, you draw your bevel cut lines upside down. And you even make goofy hand gestures to the camera like you're so good at this. Then you quickly realize you're an idiot, and you redraw your layout lines in the correct orientation, do those hand gestures again to try and make up for it. Then you just brush that off. Whatever. Let's make this cut, because this is the part when the headboard really starts to take shape, which is exciting. But you put a clamp in a spot that blocks the saw. That was dumb, but no worries, we'll just move it to another spot that also blocks the saw. I don't think there's any way I'll ever get an ego about my woodworking, because stuff like this, keeps you humble. But I will toot my own horn a little bit here because when I actually cut the bevels for this miter joint with my track saw, I cut them pretty perfectly, even though the saw couldn't cut deep enough to go all the way through. But relax, I knew this was going to happen, so, it's not a big deal. I know what I'm doing. This isn't the first time I've cut bevels that are too big for my track saw. And then with my incredible hand tool skills, I'm able to finish off these bevels with a bit of cleanup using my block plane. Yeah, I do know what I'm doing. Though maybe it's time to invest in a bigger saw. And to avoid all this pain on the smaller end pieces, I just cut those on my table saw. Seemed a bit easier. Then I could just glue everything up while continuing to question whether or not I actually do know what I'm doing. All right, when I was talking about being impatient, this is the part of the build that I was impatient for. It's the part when all of the smaller sections that I've been working on finally start to come together and reveal the bigger piece as a whole. And I'll be honest, it just might be my favorite part of a build. It's the point when you see the tabletop on the base assembly for the first time and it looks like a table. So I knew once the nightstands were attached to the headboard, I would start to feel excited about how it was all coming together. And the idea was pretty simple. Just cut a hole through the plywood so the nightstands can slide into place. And I kept the technique simple as well. Instead of trying to come up with some sort of fancy reusable jig or something, I simply used some double-sided tape to frame out where I wanted the nightstands to sit. Then I could just use a router and a template bit to cut through. And what this did was ensure that both cutouts were perfectly sized for the specific box that was going into them. Throughout the process of making these boxes, there could always be small discrepancies, so referencing the specific box on the specific side will ensure that they fit perfectly. I was also able to attach all of the panels together at this point. There are 3 panels that make up this entire headboard, and I needed to attach all of them, but I also needed to be a little bit strategic. So my thought was the only place where wood movement could potentially be a problem is in the center walnut panel, and it'll potentially move in this direction across its grain. So I decided to attach the walnut panel to the 2 slatted panels with some threaded inserts and oversized holes. That way, if the center panel started to move, it could move independently from everything else and hopefully not cause any problems. I also cut a small chamfer along the seam where the walnut meets the maple slats. So if the walnut panel does move and create a small gap, this chamfer will visually diminish the way it looks, or at least that's the hope. Two-by-fours get a bad rap in the woodworking world, and I get it. They're great for building houses, but not really so great for building nice furniture. They're usually made of pine, which is soft. The color and grain isn't the most appealing. They aren't even actually 2 inches by 4 inches. But I decided to give a couple 2x4s I had in the corner of my shop a new lease on life and make them into drawer boxes. And drawer boxes are another thing that get a bad rap, at least in my perspective. They aren't that interesting to make or watch someone make. And I make them in so many of my builds, it really feels kind of brutally repetitive from all angles. So this time I decided to use the worst wood to make the worst part of a build in the hopes of making something great. You know, the old saying, 2 wrongs make a right. And these drawer boxes were fairly small, so the width of a modern 2x4, which is like 3.5 inches if you're lucky, ended up being the perfect size. And once they were assembled and ready to go, I really don't think anyone would guess that they started out as 2x4s. But to be sure, I obviously had to add some high-end Austrian soft close drawer slides, and I also decided to make some high-end looking drawer fronts to conceal my construction grade drawers on the inside. I used some Claro walnut that I had left over, as well as the brass offcuts from the inlays on the center panel. And I decided to do a simple recess in the drawer front with the brass inlaid across it to act as the pole. I've done similar drawer poles to this in the past, and I like the nice, simple look, which I was able to get by cutting the recess and groove using a combination of my CNC router to cut the main section. Then I used my router table and some simple marks on my fence to cut the 1/4 inch wide groove that the brass would sit in. And I'm sure somebody is already typing a comment asking why I didn't just cut the recess and the groove together on the CNC. And if you've watched my other videos, you know my CNC struggles, and for whatever reason, getting a single groove cut that is the exact width of my router bit is more complicated than it seems and takes more time on the computer than it does to just set up my router table and cut the groove manually. So I did that because time is money. Here's a little bit of redemption. If you watched my last video, you know I struggled with LED lights and properly concealing them, and I wasn't happy with how it all turned out.
God, that's annoying.
So this time I was determined to not repeat that with a simple groove on the underside of the slat that would hold the LED light. And after a small miscalculation and a bit of struggling to get the concealed drawer slides reattached, I was able to install the LED lights. And I found these nice LED light bars that were an almost perfect fit where I could press them into place without any fasteners or glue. And I just added a little bit of double-sided tape on the bottom for good measure.
Last thing.
Well, like I just confidently proclaimed, this is the last thing I had to actually make on this piece. And I think the reason I kind of had to vocalize it in that moment is because this headboard probably had the most parts of any build I've done, so I was feeling a little bit accomplished. Any piece of furniture will have a lot of parts. Our example dining table, it has 4 legs, 4 aprons, a top, probably some interior bracing, maybe some leveling feet. You know, lots of little things. But this piece, I had 30 slats, the backing plywood, the center walnut panel with 3 brass inlays, 2 nightstands with drawers, the hidden LED lights, the wireless chargers, switches, wiring, and this top piece, which is what I'm making now. And understandably, I was excited it was the last thing. This part of the build was pretty unremarkable, except for the fact that I had a long piece of walnut that was about 3/4 of an inch thick straight from the lumber yard, and I needed to use almost the entire length of it, and I really didn't want to mill it any thinner. The piece was S3S, so it was surfaced on both faces and one edge, but it was also bowed and twisted like crazy. So instead of trying to get this piece flat and probably end up milling it into thin air, I decided to leave it as is and just cut it to size with some bevels on the edges. Then I could cut in some attachment holes and threaded inserts to hopefully cancel out how warped this piece is once it was attached to the rest of the headboard. I almost never have exposed fasteners in my designs, but honestly, this felt like the only way I could really ensure that I could get the top piece to flatten out. This piece was also unique because I wasn't ever going to actually see it fully assembled until it was put into its final spot. So there was a bit of anxiety as I got closer and closer to the end of the build, and trying to keep my impatience under control was difficult as well. I'm actually writing all of this voiceover while the headboard sits half built in the bedroom, and I'm going to go finish putting it together later today. So I'm not sure if my impatience comes across through this voiceover, but God, I gotta get this thing put back together. I'll be right back. Okay. I won't tell you how it all came out because I want you to watch till the end to find out. But now I can finish this video without constantly thinking about it. And one of the main things that was causing my impatient anxiety was the structural side of how to install this headboard. I had thought about just attaching it to the wall, but it got to be super heavy as all the parts started to get put together. So I didn't really want to just rely on a connection to the wall to hold it up over time, which led me to land on this kind of hybrid where I would attach 2 support posts, which would bear most of the weight, then a few screws into the wall to keep it from tipping forward. All right, well, I put this thing together, and since if you're watching this part, you've made it almost to the end of the video, and that means you must enjoy this type of stuff. So a quick plug for my Patreon page, where there's all sorts of extra content, and I'm always trying to add new stuff when I can. So go check that out if you want to support what I'm doing, and I really appreciate it. Or if you're wanting to learn woodworking and furniture making, go check out our project courses. We have a bunch of different courses to choose from. Each one has its own unique skills and challenges to help you level up your woodworking. So go check them out if that sounds like something you might be interested in. But for now, let's just take a look at this thing. You know, I always have a feeling of accomplishment whenever I finish a new piece, no matter what size it is or how intricate it might be. But this one really made me feel some pride in what I'd built. It might not be my greatest design or my most well-built piece, but like I mentioned at the beginning, the fact that I have this constant feeling where I have to one-up myself and then to actually feel like I did one-up myself feels pretty good. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you enjoyed the piece. And at the very least, I hope this headboard didn't make your headboard.